let's welcome in episode 2 of The Old Man and the Three, Stacey Abrams. Stacey, thank you so much for joining us.
It is my delight to be here. Thank you.
Before we had you on, in the weeks leading up to this, I think, like most Americans, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed right now. And there's so many things happening on so many fronts. And I kept thinking of you as someone who has been on the front lines of so many issues for such a long time. And I just kept thinking to myself, like, what is most on Stacey's mind right now? It seems like we're just getting hit from so many different angles. What is most on your mind? Like, what is the most pressing issue on your mind right now?
So it's going to sound academic, but it truly is democracy, because everything else we want to fix, the public health collapse, the economic crisis, the racial reckoning, how we recover, all of these things depend on the Americans being affected, having the ability to pick who gets to fix it. And so if we don't have that, then all of our worry is just this, cycle. It's this never-ending spiral downward. So we know that the system we have says that we got to live with what we've got until we can get something else. Therefore, my focus is on surviving now to get to the next thing. And my way of surviving is trying to build the way we get to the next thing.
Do you think that democracy is at risk? Is that the importance of this election?
Absolutely. I mean, let's take it down to like the most basic levels of government.
Yeah.
We are a representative democracy. People get upset. They're like, no, we're a republic. It's actually a completely fallacious argument. We are a democratic republic. But the way we pick people, we have said we don't have time to take a vote every time we want to make a choice. We don't have time to figure out if we're going to pick up trash on Thursday or Friday. So we're going to let other people do that for us. We call those people government. And we decide who's going to get to do it by saying, this is who gets to represent us. So that's it. We're representative democracy. If we do not get to pick the people who represent us, then our democracy is failing. And unfortunately, for the last 4 years, we have had someone at the top of our democracy who has taken every step possible to undermine our ability to be involved. When you get rid of inspectors general who are supposed to tell you whether you're doing it right or not tell you the person in charge, but tell the people who picked you, yeah, you might want to take a look at this. Well, when you get rid of that person, that's a problem. When you have three branches of government, and one of those branches is intentionally being filled with people who get the job by saying, I don't intend to do my job, that's problematic. And so, yes, I worry about our democracy in part because we take it for granted. We presume that because we survived a civil war and countless challenges that we are just invulnerable, and we're not. We're invulnerable until we fail, like everyone else. And so, yes, I worry.
Well, I think there's a certain amount of, I guess you would call it fear mongering from the left. There's fear mongering from the right. I mean, you see some of these talking points from the right about what America would look like if Joe Biden gets elected. And I think at times, for someone who's not, has not grown up in the political world, I think at times it's difficult to parse through all of this information and decide what's real and what's not real, and what I should be concerned about and what I should not be concerned about. To hear you say that democracy itself in our country is at risk is incredibly concerning.
Well, so here's the way I think about it. So let's use a sports analogy. You can know the fundamentals, but if someone's constantly moving the line, if you're the three-point guy, if the three-point line keeps being moved further and further back, and everyone can see it, but no one can talk about it, when the ref is making calls and absolutely it's wrong, but you don't have the right to say it's wrong, the game's not fair anymore. And you don't have to be a fear monger to say, I see certain things that we've all agreed are going to be so, but now I see that those things are changing and we didn't agree to the change. That's the problem with a democracy that you take for granted. When we said as a nation, we are going to let everyone in America who's eligible participate. But then we see laws that say, well, if you're Native American and you live in North Dakota, you can't vote unless you have an address on your driver's license. But, oh yeah, the people who have to give you the address have said, we're never going to give it to you, and they're the ones who passed the law, then that's not fear-mongering. That's truth. When you're a Black woman who was born in segregation and you've been able to vote for 30 years, but they change the rules and tell you, even though you are 100 years old, you suddenly don't exist for the purposes of voting, that's problematic. Or when you're a student and you're told if you have a student ID, this thing you pay money for because you're in their colleges, that's not valid, but if you have a gun license, you're good, then you have a reason to think maybe they're trying not to include me. And so I think there's a difference between fear-mongering and pointing out examples. And that's what I tried to do in the book. Because, yeah, there's a lot of noise about what is and what is not. And so I believe in facts. I believe if you're going to make an accusation, if you're going to make a call, you got to be able to show it. And so I tried to show it. But the larger issue for democracy is if people don't feel that they can participate and it's real, it's not paranoia if they really are after you. And we got to recognize that we may not like the outcome. We're not guaranteed victory. Like my side of the aisle, we may win, we may not win. I'm going to try to make sure we win. But my fundamental issue is I deserve to get to try because I'm an American just like you. And my ability to try should not be impeded just because you don't like my odds.
Stacey, for some context for some of our listeners, because I'm not sure how much they followed it in 2018, can you explain to them when so Stacey ran for governor against Brian Kemp in the state of Georgia. Can you explain some of the specifics? It'll take 100 hours to get into all the details, but some of the specifics
I want to hear them all. I want to hear them all.
Basically what happened in your race.
Okay. So ran for governor, first Black woman in American history to be the nominee for a major party. Live in the Deep South. We have a little history of problems with voting, especially for Black people. Well, Brian Kemp was the Secretary of State. He had been Secretary of State for 8 years. The first year he was Secretary of State, there was a tiny town called Quitman, and he, as Secretary of State, got word that these Black women won seats on the school board by using the laws that said they could use absentee ballots to encourage people to vote. He had them arrested. He arrested 12 people, had them charged with 120 felonies. They were under investigation for 3 years. Every single person was acquitted. That was his opening salvo. By the time we get to our race for governor, he is the person in charge of the elections. He's the election superintendent. He is the referee of the elections. He's also the scorekeeper because he's the person who is in charge of all the counties sending their numbers in. He is also the contestant. He's the player. So the guy who was in charge of the game was my opponent. Over the course of his 8 years, he oversaw the purging of 1.4 million people from the rolls, meaning they'd registered to vote and they were taken off the rolls. Not all those people were dead. Not all of them had moved. By their own admission, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of those people simply hadn't voted recently and were taken off the rolls. He held hostage 53,000 people, meaning that they applied to vote but could not get their applications processed. And he'd been told by the Obama Justice Department that the system was going to be racially discriminatory. 80% of the 53,000 were people of color, couldn't vote. He oversaw the closure of 214 precincts. People were places where you go to vote. Independent analysis says that between 54 and 80,000 people could not vote because they physically could not get to a location because not every place has transportation and public transportation. So he's in charge of all these things, and he wins the election by 54,723 votes out of a record 4 million that are cast. That's problematic. And so my issue is putting aside whether I won or lost, because I actually said, under the way the laws are written, given the way our laws work, he won, because that's the way the laws work. The laws were wrong. any law that allows that to happen, any rules that make that okay for tens of thousands of people to not be heard, that's wrong. And so he's the governor, I'm not, and I create a few organizations to try to fix it.
Stacey, I would assume these laws are written in the Constitution of Georgia. Is that
most of them are statutory, so you can the one that's in the Constitution is the fact that he got to be in charge of his own election. In any other nation, we would send in UN personnel to oversee the election.
And how long has that law been in place?
It's been in the state constitution, I think, from at least for hundreds. The problem is it's never come up before. We've never had the Secretary of State be in charge of the election while he was the contestant.
Yeah. So you, in response, you fought it, and you talk a little bit about that in the preface of your book. And you also started an organization called Fair Fight, which we're going to ask you about. But my question is, in regards to just voter suppression, how is this a solvable issue? Is this on the states? Is this on local municipalities? Is this on the federal government? Like, how do we solve this issue?
So we solve it by acknowledging the problem. We have to remember that this nation has never actually allowed everyone who's eligible to vote. Beginning of our country, only white men who owned land could vote. So if you were a white guy who rented your property, you weren't even allowed to participate. You at least had the promise that you could participate. If you were a woman, you were told to be silent. If you were Black, you were told you weren't human. If you were Native American, you are in the Constitution excluded from participation. Native Americans didn't become citizens of this country until 1924. And so for our history, we have had two major flaws, or three. One is that we never actually included everyone in the process. It took the 15th Amendment to add Black people, add Black men, the 19th Amendment to add white women. The 26th Amendment allowed young people who could die for our country to finally vote for our country. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 added everybody else. So that was one problem. Second problem is the right to vote as a citizen is your right, but the administration of that right is delegated to the states, which means that you have, again, using sports as the analogy, you've got everyone gets to play, but each team gets to decide the rules they're going to use when you come to their court. That never makes sense. The fact that you can change the rules based on where you're playing. Well, in the United States, based on which state you live in, each state gets to administer the elections the way they want. And unfortunately, in the South in particular, but around the country, the rules change. And so if I live in Oregon, I get registered automatically. I automatically get a ballot. If I move into Oregon at the last minute and want to participate, I can register that day. That's great. If I live in Alabama, there's a deadline to my registration. I had to know which day to move in if I want to participate in the election. If you live, let's say during a pandemic, you have to be 65 years or older or permanently disabled to vote by mail. Otherwise, you got to go stand in line and possibly die. And at one point, they tried to shut down the one place you could go to get your driver's license if you were Black. So from state to state, the rules change. So number one, the problem is what the Constitution has said. Number two, it's how the state administers the decisions. The solution then is to have a federal law that says this is the baseline. You can make it better, but you can't make it worse. And if that baseline is that you automatically get registered, you can register the same day so you don't have to memorize the election laws of every state you move to, that the little decisions about where your polling place is, that all of those things are made as simple as possible, then we'll join most of the rest of the democratized world. This is one of the places where we're behind.
Right. I've become friends with Andrew Yang over the past few months. This is something he talks about a ton, both in his campaign and on Twitter, is the fact we are so far behind that it's 2020 and we make it so difficult for our citizens to just participate in the most basic form of democracy.
Stacey, JJ and I were talking about vote by mail before you got on, and I'm curious. I don't think we've talked about it. I'm curious over the last month or two your thoughts on some of the developments there with what the Trump administration is trying to do with the post office. Because where I look at it, vote by mail seems like, especially in these times, seems like the best option. But if they're going to slash the budgets of the UPS to the point where people need to mail in their ballots 6 weeks before for it to be counted, does that become a thing that keeps you up at night?
Yes, I worry, but that doesn't diminish my advocacy for vote by mail, because we have to remember that there are some people for whom it literally is not feasible for them to vote in person. My parents are 71 years old. They both have underlying conditions, and we live in COVID Central. We live here in Georgia. My worry is that if my parents tried to vote, they may not survive to see the outcome of the election, because we are one of those states where you're not mandated to wear a mask, and where the administration of elections has proven to be a bit too hard for the people in charge. And so we need vote by mail, but we also need Congress to take the actions necessary to make vote by mail work. There is a bill called the HEROES Act that would solve this problem. It's not like we don't have the money, and it's not like we don't know it's an issue. But what's even more insidious is that this doesn't just affect people on my side of the aisle. The people who are the most likely to vote by mail are elderly white people. Their mail gets slowed down too. And so it's self-defeating for Republicans, or particularly, let's say the Trump administration, because there's some Republicans who are actually saying this is stupid, please stop it. We have to understand how essential the post office is, not simply to the delivery of vote by mail, but if you've ever lived in a rural area, it's the way you get your medicine. It's the way you get your food. This is an essential service, and this just mean-spirited idea that I can win an election by putting millions of people in harm's way is problematic, but that doesn't diminish the necessity of vote by mail. And that's why Fair Fight and other organizations, we're doing our best to sue to make it better, to make it as easy as possible, to get drop boxes for people if they need it, to change the laws that say it doesn't have to be returned by election day, it just has to be postmarked by election day. So you create as many opportunities for people to mitigate the harm of what's happening to the post office. But if they pass the HEROES Act, the post office will get the money it needs to keep operating and to operate at a better level.
It's funny you mentioned the politics of it, because a lot of the people that cover Florida in particular, Florida's always one of the sort of key presidential swing states. They basically say the Republicans, anytime a Republican wins in Florida, it's because of vote by mail. It's because that's their base. And so all the Republicans down there are waving these red flags, being like, this is going to screw us. We need to be able to vote by mail.
And that's the thing. So in Florida, if you are Black, you are 2 times as likely to have your absentee ballot rejected. If you're Latino, 2 times as likely. If you're a young person, it's 5 times. You're 5 times more likely to have your ballot rejected. And when you do this, you're not only hurting the people who rely on it, you're also undermining the likelihood that some of your potential voters are not going to start participating, because they're going to think, well, the whole system is rigged against us. They don't want us, so I'm not going to bother. And that goes back to JJ's fundamental question. I worry for our democracy when those in charge of it are doing their best to dissuade and discourage participation in it. You don't do that when the whole point is that you should hear from the people, that your power accrues from the participation of the people. Taking any steps that would undermine their willingness to participate is not only self-defeating, but that's how you move towards nihilism. I mean, I'm taking it a bit far, but that's how it starts. When you tell the very people who need it the most that they are inconsequential, or worse, that they are a problem, that has a long-term effect on the rest of how society operates.
Stacey, this may be a very naive question, and I apologize.
No, please.
But I've heard those stats about absentee ballots getting rejected, and my question is, what does that mean? What does that mean? Yeah, how is that possible? Like, what? Why? Yeah, exactly.
No. And so it's not naive. I mean, this is the whole reason for the book, because a lot of this stuff, you have to spend, I mean, it took me months to find all this, and I do this for a living. And I had to sit there and read through 15 books and spend way too much time on websites and calling people, asking them questions. So here's what happens for young people, because these stats actually bear out across the country. Number one, when absentee ballots are sent out, the rules aren't always clear. So if you did an absentee ballot in California versus Connecticut versus Florida, the rules for how you fill it out are different. Some places you have to put it back in the envelope a specific way and everything has to be, perfect. Other states, they're like, yeah, just get it back to us, we're good. And so in certain states, the more complicated the rules are, the less likely a young person or someone who may not have an active participation in this process, they're more likely to be rejected. And because it is harder for people of color to vote in this country, because young people are usually first timers doing this, they are the most likely to not actually follow the rules exactly the way they're written because they may not understand them. And in some states, they'll call you and say, look, you sent it back wrong. I'm going to send it back to you, fill it out if you'll just fix these things. But often for communities of color, and they're often identifiable by their names or by their ages, they're not given a chance to fix it. So that's one reason. Number two, there's this thing called signature matching. So you fill it out, you sign the back, and you send it back. Well, often the people looking at the ballots are, and let's be clear, they're typically white, typically older, around the average age is around 61. If your name is not a familiar Anglo-Saxon name, they may not recognize the signature or think that something's wrong. And they'll reject it, saying, well, this just doesn't match, or we don't think this is right. The other reality is signature matching, this is a secret, it's completely junk science. It's like watching Forensic Files the night before and saying, now I can tell who you are based on looking at your signature. It doesn't work that way. Scientists will tell you that the average person cannot match a signature that way. My signature does not match from CVS to Kroger because they use different little boxes for me to sign my name in. And so sometimes my name has 12 letters, sometimes it's like recognizable S, Y, and an A. And then the rest of it's just whatever I could make fit into the box. Well, if you're a young person who doesn't sign your signature on a piece of paper a lot, then your signature may not match the time you signed the little box at the DMV when you were signing up to get your driver's license. That is used as a justification for throwing out your application.
That's very interesting.
So with the idea that that it's an older white person reading, like how do we have that not happen?
So what we were able to get done in Georgia is a consent order where they have to let you prove you are who you say you are. So they can't just throw it out, which is what happens in a lot of states. They just throw out your ballot. Now they have to at least tell you, we think that there's a problem, so we need you to prove who you are. So the first is just letting people cure. It's called curing your ballot. To let people cure, let them prove who they are. Number two, it's actually not using this flawed system because we don't have a voter fraud problem in America. People aren't putting on, top hats and mustaches to get back in line to vote again. We have a hard enough time getting people to vote the first time. And so part of it is just acknowledging that if someone is willing to go through that process, they're probably who they say they are. You've asked them questions. You've got enough information to validate that they are who they say they are. But the third is that we need better training and we need more people. We need more diversity in who's actually doing the process. So it's a long-term solution that's made easier if you go into a system like an Oregon, like a Washington State, like a Colorado, where they've been doing vote by mail for decades, 20 years in Oregon. They have 0.0002% fraud error rate. I mean, and you have to work to make it wrong. And so that should be actually how we approach it.
Stacey, can you talk about just the importance of the census going on right now and some of the issues that we're dealing with surrounding that?
So in our time is now, if you just really I find it to be the most fascinating topic that nobody cares about, and that's the census. So we all think of it as this deeply intrusive, once a decade invasion of privacy. What I like to tell folks is if you have a cell phone or a utility bill, they already know how to find you. The census just lets them know what you need. And so what the census does is it's a handful of questions that tell them who you are, where you live. It confirms what they already have, but then it gives them data about your age and who's in your household. And all of that data is aggregated. So they can't use it to pick you out of a lineup. It's put together about your community. And it says that in this community, it's, 1/3 Puerto Rican, 1/3 African American, and 1/3 white. And because of programs that are allocated based on what we know to be racial issues that tend towards certain communities, financial issues that certain communities face, we have more than 300 programs that we allocate money through. And it's $1.5 trillion right now that goes out every single year. So Pell Grants or school lunches, all of that data is used to determine how much money your community gets. So if you know of a school system that's overcrowded, it's because they undercounted how many kids were in that school. And the thing is, they didn't count them the year before. In 2010, they counted how many kids were already likely to be heading into the school system. And so for the next 10 years, they've basically made all of their decisions based on that number from 2010. You'll adjust it a little bit, but they never changed the denominator. So in communities that typically don't participate in the census because they're not asked or they don't trust it, then they tend to be undercounted. That means they never get the money. And every year you don't get the money you need, things get worse. I mean, if you've ever been in debt, your debt gets worse when you can't climb out. On top of that, what's happening this year, the Trump administration put in place, they tried to put a citizenship question. That was designed to scare people of color out of filling out the census because the most likely immigrants in our country are communities of color. That question didn't go on the census, but they put out the information enough that people got scared. They also underfunded the census, so the hardest to count communities, which are typically people of color, rural communities, and young people, they didn't get the information they needed. And now we go into this section of the census called the non-response follow-up period. That's when people come and knock on your doors. Typically, that takes 75 days, and they know it's going to take some time, and so we usually allow 75 days. Well, because of COVID, it was supposed to start on May 14th. It's been delayed now until August 11th. But when it was going to start on May 14th, it was going to end on July 31st. Just yesterday, they announced that they are going to stop it on September 30th, which means instead of 75 days, they're only going to take 45 days. The problem is, typically, we are further ahead in the count. More people have participated. At this point, 40% of Americans have not responded to the census. And so instead of saying we're going to take longer so we can get everyone, they intend to take less time because they know if they don't count everyone, the people who are missing are more likely to be Native American, Black, and Latino. And the API community is back by about 2%, but the Latino community is undercounted right now by 12%. Blacks, we're down by 14%, and Native Americans are down by 25%. And so here's what that means, bottom line. It means you lose money. $8.2 billion will be sucked out of communities of color because they aren't counted. Plus, the political districts that get drawn. So when you vote for school board, when you vote for city council, when you vote for Congress, those lines are drawn based on these exact same numbers. So the same numbers that didn't count the number of kids in your schools, if they don't count the people, when they draw those lines, you will not be included in how they draw the lines because right now, racial gerrymandering, meaning drawing the lines to hurt people of color, is unconstitutional. But if you can't prove there were people of color because they didn't get counted, you can draw the lines any way you want. And that means for the next 10 years, communities of color will have even less power than they have now.
Is there an online solution to this? Is there for like us? I mean, JJ and I talk about this all the time, and obviously, Stacey, you and I have talked about this as well. But between the NBA and the sort of entertainment community and things like that, a lot of people are engaged right now across the board, socially and politically. Is this something where if the spotlight was shined on it in a specific way, there might actually be a fix?
Yes, absolutely. So that's one of the reasons I'm so excited to be here. We need as many people as possible talking about the census as a positive, telling people not to be afraid of it, and explaining what's at stake if they don't fix it. If you care about racial justice, if you've been marching in the streets, the resources to actually fix the things in your communities, those monies come from the census. But if your entire community isn't counted, then you won't get the resources you need. And they can pass all the laws they want, but if you want to move the funding to cover the cost of housing, the money for housing comes through the census. And if you don't get included and your community is ignored, you never get those dollars. And so yes, we'd love all the help we can get. We've been able to engage a lot of celebrities and influencers, and we need even more because we need folks who are trusted to tell people it's okay to fill out the census and it's a bad thing if you don't. But they're not going to come after you. You're not going to get deported. You're not going to have a warrant pulled on you. They're not going to force you to pay your child support. They can't use that data for anything other than giving you what you need. And that's why they're so afraid that people are going to fill it out, because we are a more diverse nation than we have ever been. And if we don't get counted for the next decade, we don't count.
I think that's wonderfully explained. And actually, it's actually kind of eye-opening to me. We run into a little bit of an issue when you talk about people you can trust, because there's a lot of mistrust, especially online right now. And I don't know that that's solvable, but it's certainly a problem that just continues to crop up. And Tommy and I have talked about this a bunch in terms of entertainers, athletes, celebrities, whatever you want to call it, spreading misinformation, and it perpetuates the cycle of mistrust. And it really is becoming because essentially everyone has some sort of platform, microphone, voice, whatever you want to call it, because of social media. And so there's so much misinformation that at times it's like, well, I don't really trust anybody. I mean, I'm not speaking necessarily for myself here. I'm just saying that is a sentiment that I think is very valid across the country.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons I try to speak to a diverse group of people who can share the information. So if you hear the same information, not just from the community you know and trust, but by people you've never thought of, when you triangulate the information and it's coming from different quarters, then people start to believe it's so, because you've got people who have no reason to coordinate their lie.
Yeah.
And my mission is to make sure I'm telling this to everyone. Look, if I were invited on Tucker Carlson's show, I'd say the exact same thing. When I campaigned for governor, Tommy knows this, I campaigned at one music fest, at Dragon Con, at a gun show, and where they filmed Deliverance.
Stacey moves around. You're all over the place.
But in part because you can't trust someone if you think they're only going to say things in the dark or whisper it to the people they like. So you can dislike me, but everyone's going to dislike me for the same reason. They're all going to have the same set of data points to decide whether they want me or not. Because it's not to my benefit to pretend something when I'm talking to this group and then say, well, I didn't mean it when I'm talking to this group. You're all going to hate me. So you're all going to get the same information, the same opportunity to be really annoyed. And we have to do that with information. We have to understand that we have an information overload in our nation right now, and information is not the same as truth. And so I do my best to back up everything I say with data, and data that you can, if you're bored and want to check me, you can check me with multiple sources. For example, when I talk about voter fraud, I don't use the Brennan Center, which is the gold standard for what these things are. I use the Heritage Foundation. Heritage Foundation has no use for me. It is a hyper-conservative organization, but I'll use their numbers because their numbers make my point. 1,300 examples of potential voter fraud out of 625 million votes cast just in federal elections. When I say it's rare, 1,300 out of 625 million, those are Vegas odds. So you can trust me not because I'm giving you information that supports my point from people who already agree with me. I give you information from the other side because I need you to trust, even if you don't like me, trust what I'm saying. And I think getting celebrities and athletes and people from different parts of our society to share information and to reinforce the validity of that information, you're not going to get everyone, but you cut through some of the cynicism and some of the mistrust.
One of the things happening right now in my own life, of course, is being in the NBA bubble. And besides just playing basketball, there is a wave of activism happening in our league. I should also mention there's a wave of activism happening in the WNBA, and those women have been far ahead of the curve and have been doing this for a number of years. And I think there's a real desire to help. And for a lot of guys, that can mean using their resources. It can mean using their voice. But for someone like Maya Moore, who literally gave up basketball and was on the front lines and advocating for someone, I think a lot of us, myself included, in our league want to do something beyond just using our voice. And we're all trying to figure that out in real time. And I'm wondering what are some of the ways that we can make a difference beyond just, let's say, beyond just donating to a cause or talking about Breonna Taylor or kneeling in protest or wearing a T-shirt. What are some of the ways we can sort of move beyond just that?
So I'm going to begin by saying, do not underestimate the effectiveness of even those things. Because remember, 5 years ago, where even those things were considered anathema to who you are and what you do. So we can't underestimate the importance of even those baseline, because those baselines didn't exist 5 years ago. You've made progress because of the persistence of effort. So I want to say that and say thank you. The next level of effort is then to use your platform, not simply to say, but to do, including information about how, you play for the Pelicans, including information about how to register to vote in Louisiana, not just information, but like good information that says, here's how each of these things happen. And here are common questions that people have, and here's some information for you. So that when they come to your website, when they go to your social media platform, they know that you're going to give them information. I've had the privilege of talking to Coach Casey with the Pistons and Coach Pierce here in Georgia. And, I was on a call with Doc Rivers and the Clippers. I didn't get to talk to the Clippers, but I talked to Doc Rivers of the Clippers. And I've been able to work with them to have conversations about the fact that the Pistons and the Hawks are going to use their arenas to hold elections. It's making sure that everyone you talk to, that you can sign off on all of your emails and all of your texts. Everything from now on should be about the census, telling people, fill out the census. That repetition of information changes minds. And the more people who do it, if you can't go onto your Twitter feed without seeing something about the census, if people just fill it out to get you to stop, that's fantastic. It's making sure people know, here are the rules for vote by mail where you live. So send them to Fair Fight 2020 or Fair Count about the census or to vote.org, giving them places to go that are trusted places to get that information. Those are incredible. Those have incredible impact and should not be underestimated. And then if there is a community you want to adopt, an area that you know is suffering, COVID-19, and you know this, what it's doing to the South in particular is horrific. One thing I was able to do, and it was a small thing, but I was able to get food delivered to pantries in Alabama and in Georgia, in part because somebody out there had food, they didn't know where it needed to go. I was able to help them. So sometimes it feels small, but finding a place that is being lost to time and to information and being the person who sends it. What Maya Moore did for that man was one man, but it raised this macro issue that people are paying attention to. Food, the hunger pervading our communities right now is horrific. In a nation of plenty, the number of children and families that are starving is absurd. If that's an issue that moves your heart, figure out how you can be the person in that community to drive change there, but then to talk about it, because it's not about self-aggrandizement. It's about awareness. So it's not, I did this thing. It's, did you know this thing is happening? What are you doing about it where you are?
Yeah. You bring up the food issue. like basically the first week of the pandemic when everything shut down, that was the first thing that hit my mind was people are going to be out of work. People are not going to be able to leave their homes. People need food. And it was the first issue that my wife Chelsea and I tackled. We made a donation to Second Harvest Food Bank in New Orleans. We brought on some partners. We were able to provide, I think, 1.8 million meals, which was awesome. But I've always had a problem with promoting that. Do you know what I mean? Like it's easier for me to say, go fill out your census than it is to bring awareness to an issue that I've essentially participated in myself. There's like a balance there, I think, at times for me personally that I struggle with a little bit.
So the way I would do it is it's not about you and what you did. It's about the fact that you know this is an issue and you're encouraging others to do something about the issue. The scale of your investment, particularly among those who could be doing the same thing you've got players who listen to you, who watch what you do, saying to your fellow players, here's something I've done. Here's the scale at which it can be done. You should think about doing it too. Then again, it's not about self-aggrandizement. It's about engagement. And you and I have something in common. I'm an introvert. I enjoy my time alone. I find when I would campaign, I would knock on doors when we were allowed to have human contact. I would pray that the person did not answer the door. I'm like, God, please don't be home. Please don't be home. And then they would open the door. And I'm like, damn it. Hi, I'm Stacey Abrams and I would like your vote. And I could turn it on. But the best days where I'm like, I'm going to count to 10 and then I'm gone. So, and similarly, I don't like talking about what I do, but I had to realize that if I don't talk about it, others aren't going to know to do something about it. I've been lambasted for being too ambitious. If you ask me if I want to do something to serve my country, it's absurd for me to say, no, I'm sorry, I don't want to. Or worse, oh, maybe, because I'm a Black woman from the Deep South. We don't have a lot of examples of people on a national scale paying attention to who we are and what we want. I am not going to blow my shot for me or for anyone else. And what you are doing when you talk about what you and your wife, Chelsea, have done, it's not about, oh, how great I am. It's about, here's what I've done and I need to do more, so I need you to help me do more. That's your conversation. That's your point of entry. It's not about congratulating yourself. It's about challenging yourself to do more and asking others to join you in doing for those around them.
I've never thought about it that way. And that's a great perspective in terms of the engagement and raising awareness. I want to touch on something you just said. There's a quote in your book. I don't think you said the quote because you had it in quotes in your book. You cannot be what you cannot see. And, obviously you're writing the book. I thought of you, but I also thought of someone like Barack Obama and what that meant for him to be president. In a way, like as NBA players, for a lot of my peers that came from difficult socioeconomic backgrounds, they are the example in their communities as a means to get out. Basketball as a means to get out. And I think the examples, that we could go down the list across all fields and all races, but the example of success for certain people is such an inspiration. And Stacey, you're obviously one of those people. And I just wanted to mention that just because it really touched me when I read that in the book.
Thank you. I am the great granddaughter of slaves. I am the great granddaughter of sharecroppers. I am the great granddaughter of domestic workers. I am the granddaughter of two people who were cooks at a university. Their children were legally prohibited from attending, and they worked there for 40 years. I'm the daughter of a woman who was the head librarian at a college where the janitor made more money than she did, and the daughter of a man who was the first man to go to college in his family but couldn't get a job in an office because he had undiagnosed learning disabilities. I became the first Black woman in American history to stand for governor for a major party. My responsibility is to never forget what got me here and never take for granted that I get to be here, but more importantly, to make certain that no one else has to doubt their ability to join me, and even more, to surpass me. My obligation is to create space for others to see their possibilities, because someone saw it in me. My mom and dad had no reason to believe that they could raise children who could do the things we've been privileged to do, but they believed in themselves and in us enough that they were going to create every opportunity possible. I do my work because not everyone gets to have Robert and Carolyn Abrams as their parents. If everyone had my parents, the world would be different and better, but they don't get that, so they've got me. My job is to make it possible to step into the space where folks who wanted more but never knew what more looked like or could never figure out how to get to more could do it. And that's what you do. That's what celebrity and influencers and athletes can do. You can step into those spaces for people who can't see themselves, can't imagine more for themselves, and you can create that space for even for a moment where they think that there is something else for them.
Stacey, did you have a favorite memory of Congressman Lewis?
I did. So he was my congressman for more than a decade. But I remember when I went to ask him to endorse me for governor, and we sat in his office, he sent everyone out of the room, and he just talked to me about how important it was, because he'd grown up under Jim Crow governors, and how he, as much as he lived in DC and in Atlanta, and as much power as he saw in the mayors of our towns and in the presidency of Barack Obama, that governors had this extraordinary power that people so rarely understood. Jim Crow never had a single federal law. It was all the province of governors and state legislators. And he grabbed my hand and he said, we need governors who look like you. And we got to walk out on his balcony overlooking the Capitol. And that's the picture I posted the night he passed. But he understood it wasn't just about me running for a seat. It was that he understood at this visceral level what it was. But the thing was, he believed that I could do it. Because he said, a young Black girl being the governor of Georgia, and he stopped and he said, there are going to be a lot of people rolling over in graves. And he had this mischievous smile that went along with just the deep sincerity of the moment, because we both understood he's from Alabama. I grew up in Mississippi and came of age in Georgia. What that means in the South to see leadership that is so different from 50 years ago. He was willing to step out on a limb for me. And that means the world.
Did you guys see the Trump interview on Axios on HBO?
Yes, I've seen parts of it.
Okay.
I endure 37 minutes of that, but yeah.
Yeah, I've seen parts of it too. But there's a moment where he gets asked about John Lewis, and why do you think that he can't or won't even really acknowledge him? Is it because he doesn't know, or is it because of a more nefarious reason?
It's for the simplest reason. He is a small man who is unable to acknowledge greatness that doesn't reflect on him. And when John Lewis refused to attend that inauguration, and when he held court and talked about just how wrong Trump has been, in the face of such moral clarity, a coward and just a craven man like Donald Trump cannot acknowledge goodness in that form. And John Lewis wasn't a perfect man, but he did everything in his power to be a good man. And that is something Donald Trump has never attempted, and he cannot abide.
What is it like taking shots from the president? You've taken some shots. I've said a few things about him on social media and in interviews, and of course there's incredible backlash from the from the MAGA crowd in my comment section, which I tend to ignore. But I've never, obviously, I'm a very small figure, but I've never taken any shots from him. What is that like?
It is surprising that for someone who dismisses my capacity so greatly, that he has taken so much of his time to disparage me. He has, generated some fairly mean-spirited memes about me, but I appreciate the space that I occupy in his head, and the fact that he's got to think about me and worry about me, and I intend to keep making him and his ilk worry.
Stacey, we're gonna change topics. I wanted to ask you about this. I wanted to touch on this a little bit. Just the notion of American exceptionalism, and I think in most schools, this idea of American exceptionalism is taught. I think through the media, through film and television. The American American exceptionalism is sort of a way of life here. When I was at Duke, my senior year, my last class I needed for my major was a class taught by Professor Gerald Wilson called American Dreams, American Myths. And the entire course was basically debunking American exceptionalism. And there's the success myth, the frontier myth, the agrarian myth, foreign devil myth, and the city on a hill myth. I could go into each one, but you can sort of get an idea of the thesis of the class. And it was the first time in my life where these notions were ever really questioned. And you talk about in your book that the idea of self-made success is a myth. People have a hard time accepting that. Why do you think that is?
Okay. Some of us, let's be clear, some of us are raised not only with the notion of American exceptionalism, but with the inherent idea that then makes us personally exceptional. But for entire swaths of American society, there is no expectation of us being, competitive, let alone exceptional. And so what I want people to understand through, and lead from the outside, the mission was to say, exceptionalism is an aspiration. It is not a given. And for too many of us, it's not an expectation. In fact, it is seen as a detraction from who we are. Because if you aspire to exceptionalism, you're not willing to be the functionary we need you to be, and you're going to be in places we don't expect you to show up, and in fact, we don't want you there. In Our Time Is Now, the book about elections and about our, sort of the future of America, my through line there is that identity politics is important because it is how we construct ourselves as a part of the American story. It's how we explode the myths that you reference. Because if you don't understand how opportunity is thwarted and you don't understand how opportunity is built, then you cannot participate in this larger ethic of what it means to be America, because you don't see yourself in the story. And part of identity politics, part of leadership, is being able to situate yourself in the story and see yourself as a central player and not as a footnote. And so my mission is to, through the nonfiction that I write, to arm people with the information and the tactics, because it's not enough to say, yes, you can do this. I hate Horatio Alger stories. They're the stupidest things because they create this notion and this mythology that is so easily proven wrong, but most people never get to that part because they got defeated by the notion. And so my mission is to say, in leadership, here's who you are and what you can do. Here are the tactics. Here are the rules they never give you. And as an American society, here's how we apply it to the thing that governs most of our lives, which is how our politics work. And if we can do those two things, if we can connect those dots and create this connective tissue, we actually can move towards an exceptionalism. We can move towards being the city on the hill. But we can't be there if most of us are still down at the bottom trying to figure out how we can climb up.
I don't think there's an argument you can make that America is the city on the hill. That we are the beacon of light for the rest of the world right now. I think that's
COVID especially.
Yeah.
I think that the sheer incompetence of this administration, coupled with the theft of American ideals that we've seen playing out, because let's be clear, Trump is a symptom. He is not the disease. And as long as we allow him to occupy our minds as the disease itself, then we think we can excise him in November and we're good. No, he is a symptom. He took advantage of 40 years of undermining who we are as America and disinvesting in what we should be. The reason we have the public health crisis we have today is that for 40 years, Republicans have, suborned unfortunately by Democrats, have worked to dismantle investment in public health. The reason you have public health is because sometimes there's a Spanish flu that kills millions, or a pandemic that kills thousands. 1,000 people a day dying in this country, many because they do not know that they can go to the doctor and get that cough checked out because they're afraid it could cost them their house because they can't afford the bill. Like, those are the challenges. Those are the things that are chafing. But what I hold to is that sometimes the ideal is more important than the reality. And what this election can allow us to do is to start resetting the ideal of the competency of a democracy, the ideal of inclusion in a democracy, the ideal that democracy is a better approach to the world than authoritarianism. Because right now, for the 14th year in a row, authoritarianism is making some heavy strides and democracy is sliding. And so I don't reject wholly the notion of American exceptionalism, but we've got to see it as an aspiration and not as something we have already accomplished.
Well, I was just going to add, one of the talking points anytime anyone on the left complains is go leave the country. If you hate this country so much, go leave. Well, first of all, I was born here. My family's here. I'm not leaving this country. But secondly, I think we can all agree we just want America to live up to the ideals that we think it can be. And whether it's exceptional or not, the blueprint is there, but we have to start solving some of these issues. At some point, these issues have to be solved because, to your point, Stacey, you know, we can talk about slavery and we can talk about Jim Crow and segregation, but since the Civil Rights Act, we haven't solved the issue. It's gotten, I guess, better. There's certain things that have happened and it's gotten better, but we haven't solved any of these issues. And I'm not just talking about race. I'm talking about healthcare. I'm talking about voting. I'm talking about public housing. I'm talking about education. There's so many issues we have to solve. And so it's not about complaining or wanting to leave. It's about let's make America what we all think it can be.
Well, again, going back to a sports metaphor, and I feel bad that I'm making more of them than you are, but it's as though, you know, because we had one good game, we don't have to practice anymore, and that we don't have to do the work to stay good and get better. That we are, you know, a subpar performer, but we're better than somebody, so yay, we're great. No, your job is to be best. God, I just quoted Melania Trump. But your job is to be the best. Your job is to be as good as possible. And you cannot be as good as possible when entire swaths of your society can barely imagine survival. That's the challenge. And that's what the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, that's what the ADA was supposed to do. It's what we believed is part of the Supreme Court decision on the LGBTQ community. It's part of the reason that what happened in Florida when they re-enfranchised millions of ex-offenders only to have it stolen away is a travesty. But it's also why I celebrate Andy Beshear in Kentucky, who quietly has re-enfranchised thousands of ex-offenders. It's what Terry McAuliffe was willing to do in Virginia and what's continued under Ralph Northam. We have opportunities every day to be better. And that's what we should aspire to. That's what we should organize for. and I'm not leaving either. My people built this place, cleaned it, cooked for it. I'm here. This is mine. And my patriotism demands that I work for the best we can be, not settle for this notion of what we think we are.
I want to touch on one more thing before we get to our draft. And that's just leadership. And I know we talked a little bit right when you got on about this. But if you were to just list sort of your ideal qualities of a great leader, what do those qualities look like?
First is a willingness to help. And that sounds backwards to a lot of folks because they think it should be internal. Leaders are there to serve. That's the point. Whether it's serving customers or serving constituents or serving clients, your job is service. And so your first responsibility is being able to effectively ask, how can I help? And then building the skills to make that so. Number two, it's ambition. I don't want a leader who's not ambitious, because if you're satisfied with where you are, then that means you're not leading, you're standing. I need someone who's got a plan for us to get somewhere else. And number three, it's fallibility. Leaders who cannot admit mistakes, not only do they lie, they create an environment where other people refuse to make mistakes, or worse, where they refuse to try. And if you aren't willing to try, or worse, when you lie about your failures, you undermine the credibility, but you also undermine the creativity. I need people who tell the truth. I made a mistake. I didn't do this right. If you make a lot of them, then you probably should not be in that role. But your willingness to acknowledge fallibility keeps you out of jail, and it actually keeps you moving forward.
Well, I think failure has become such a buzzword in leadership. And one of the reasons is you can't really have growth unless you sort of acknowledge and confront your own failure or your organization's failure. And if you're not being truthful around that failure, then number one, you're doing a disservice to yourself as a leader, but you're obviously doing a disservice to the people that you're in charge of leading. And it's a really dark cycle if you're not willing to admit mistakes or willing to sort of assess what those failures were and are.
I mean, when I started, I became Democratic leader. I had a very young staff because that was all I could afford. And one of the rules I had was, look, you guys, I need you to experiment. We don't know what we're doing. We've never been in this posture before. Your job is to experiment, but tell me the truth and tell me what worked, tell me what didn't work. I will take responsibility for the failures. You get credit for the success unless you lie to me, unless you try to hide it from me, because then I can't trust you. And if I can't trust you to try and to tell me what worked and didn't work, how can I give you even more responsibility? And yeah, we made some big mistakes. There were things we tried that were just stupid, but I prefer trying and being stupid than stasis that is just stale.
Who are some of the best leaders you guys have been around?
So in politics, the closest person I've gotten to work with, Shirley Franklin, was an extraordinary mayor of Atlanta. She came in the midst of a crisis, multiple crises, ethics crisis, morale crisis, water sewer crisis. And she is someone who understood not just the politics, she understood the mechanics. And that's what I try to be. Like, I care about the mechanics of how things work. And then I use the politics to make them better. I learned that from her. My parents are extraordinary pastors, but I lift up my mom in particular because she had to convince a bunch of people to give up their own power to create a single church and then lead that church. And together with my dad ran the outreach ministry, a man who was willing to run something where his wife was in charge. That kind of leadership and that type of feminism teaches me more every single day. I'll start with those three.
I've obviously played for some great coaches, and I've been around some really great leaders as players. I've gotten to know leaders in other fields. The best leader I've ever been around, though, is my own father. And number one, he was the leader of our family. I'm in the middle of 5 kids. As a parent, as a caretaker, as a provider, he did whatever it took for his family. And there were times where he was unemployed. There was an 18-month stretch where he was unemployed, and he was going around at church and offering to remodel people's bathrooms. Anything just to put food on the table and pay the bills. When I think of the qualities of a great leader, and Tommy and I have talked about some of these qualities on the podcast before, self-awareness, humility, compassion. Like, I learned those things from my father. And Stacey, to your point about service, my dad, he eventually became a counselor and a life coach. Like, he spent his entire adult life helping others. And I'm glad you said that as a quality, because it's such a mark of a great leader.
I don't know if you know this, but I'm the second of 6 kids.
Yeah.
My dad was hurt on the job. He worked at a Ingalls shipbuilding, fell, shattered his arms and his knees, broke his back, and they threatened to pull his workers' comp if he didn't get this experimental surgery that no one in the state of Mississippi had ever performed, and he refused it. And they said, well, we're not going to pay your workers' comp. My dad went from being able to provide for our family along with my mom. My mom was a librarian at the time, but they were in partnership. We were working poor. And my dad ended up delivering pizzas because, for him, his responsibility was always, central to who he was. And, he and my mom had just the strongest partnership I've ever seen in my life. And with the 6 of us, it has been always what they do is how we learn to be who we are.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. So many gems here, Stacey. Your insight on all this stuff has just been amazing. We really appreciate it. We do have to get to the draft, though.
Yes.
Tommy, do you want to explain what the draft premise is this for this episode?
So basically, Stacey, we do a thing on every show where we the two of us and a guest, we draft something as random as possible. Today we were thinking about doing, because we know you are such a big TV watcher, we were thinking about doing, you're stuck on a 15-hour flight. You can pick to whatever destination, the transatlantic flight. You have 5 TV shows you have to watch, basically. That's it.
Okay.
And so you have the first pick. And then obviously, like, if you pick something, if it was on our board, we can't take it. And so you have the first pick. I have the second pick. JJ has third and fourth, and vice versa. And Stacey, I'm just going to preface this. JJ is a historically horrible drafter. He has really bad film and television taste, just for the record. So we'll get into it with that, and we'll go from there.
I'm going to reserve judgment. I have broad taste. But
Fair warning: in any of these drafts, I don't pander to other people's opinions. I choose what I like. I've always done it. Even with cereal, I've picked it. All right, Stacey, you have the first pick.
Star Trek Voyager.
Oh, wow.
Interesting. You're a huge Trekkie, right?
Trekkie.
Your whole life?
Oh my God. So since 1987, I didn't get to watch the original series because it was on CBS. But we had ABC and Fox by the time I was in high school, and the Star Trek Next Generation started in 1987 on Fox.
Yeah.
Love it. Tommy.
I'm going Curb for my first pick.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I did not expect that from
Curb
you.
it's very rewatchable. I mean, that's the thing, is I need a show on a flight that I've seen before, so it's very hard for me in that setting to really get into a new thing. There's so many different distractions. And so I've seen every episode 10 times, and you can just keep going.
All right, I'm going to go with 24 as my first pick. I feel like I don't know that I could get through all 24 episodes of a season, but I could probably come pretty close because their episodes are actually like 40 some minutes. And then my second pick, I'm going to throw a little curveball here because I'll probably be traveling with my children, is Ninjago. It's actually Ninjago is one of my favorite shows ever, and my kids, I have two boys, they're almost 6 and 4. They're obsessed with it. They just want to be ninjas. But the show itself, if you're an adult and you watch it, it's actually really enjoyable.
I have a question about yours. Do you include the reboot of 24 in your 24? Okay.
No.
How many seasons was 24?
5?
5 or 6? 5 or 6?
Yeah.
Yeah. I watched all the seasons.
I did too.
Yeah, it was such a great show.
5. And there was an uneven season in there. And then they picked it up by the time they finished, and then the reboot. Yeah.
All right, 2, I'm going Breaking Bad.
I would Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Are you shaking your head in disbelief?
I know
no,
of
I'm
it.
I'm shaking my head because your picks are just amazing. I've definitely watched Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I'm not a Trekkie, but I see where we're headed here. I see where we're headed, and I love it.
And so I got a second one,
Yep.
or I'm done.
No, you got 2.
So this gets a little Alias.
Oh, great show.
Great show.
Alias had a run where that was the show for like 2 or 3 years.
It was awesome. I mean, Bradley Cooper, Jennifer Garner, directed by J.J. Abrams. What could go wrong?
Yeah. My issue with this right now is there are a few shows that I'm thinking about picking that are great, but are not really like appropriate for a plane. You know, because you always have that thing where you're like, I don't want to pick Oz.
Who's watching?
Yeah, Oz is a great show. I don't know if it's my top 5 show, but you can't watch Oz on a flight. It's just, I don't even know if they would play it on a flight. Like I would need it on an iPad. So there has to be some level of just like appropriateness and not wanting to be judged by the person sitting next to you. I think I'm going Veep for my third. I think Veep is a pretty perfect comedy from beginning to end. I think it just is I don't remember a bad episode, and they ended at the right time. They got out. Stacey, did you have any thoughts on it being in this world on the show?
It was way too close to home. That and Parks and Rec are just both way too accurate.
I was thinking about Veep during that Axios interview. There was a lot of that. There was a lot of Veep energy in that.
It did feel like a little bit of a parody watching that interview. All right. I got 2 more. So I'm going to go with my favorite show ever because I can just basically rewatch any season on that flight, and that's Mad Men. And fourth, I'm going to go the OC.
Interesting.
Bold choice.
OC season 1, yes. OC falls off.
Season 1? Yeah, I know.
It falls off hard. It becomes unwatchable by the end.
When I was in college, that was when it was really popular, and I used to go to Chris Duhan's apartment off campus, and we would have viewing parties with like 12 people. This is pre-DVR. Somebody would inevitably like put a cassette tape in or VHS and record it. So if anybody like wanted to rewatch it, we could do it that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
What's your feeling on Entourage?
Me?
I was watching this last night. Yeah.
Originally, it was a good show, but it just became unwatchable. I actually stopped watching it in like season 6 or something. I would also say Entourage stunted my entire generation. Our adult maturity was stunted by several years from watching that show.
Stacey, did you ever see it or no?
I've never watched it.
You should watch like 2 episodes just to get a sense of it, but I don't know if it's for you.
I know about it. I just have never felt compelled to actually do more than that.
I'm going Arrested Development. Speaking of Arrested Development, I'm going that for 4. That's another one for me, which you just can keep rolling through. There's also so many episodes. Each season has like 25 episodes in it or something like that.
Tommy, of the shows you're picking right now, like Veep and Curbed and Arrested Development, the first 3 seasons, the original 3 seasons, unbelievable.
Yeah, it's
my favorite.
Perfect.
That is my sense of humor to the nth degree.
So I would pick Living Single, which I would say was the precursor to Sex and the City and was the quintessential roommate comedy, even as someone who grew up watching Three's Company. And I would add to that Leverage, which is just a fun heist show that is clever and fun all the time.
What is that on? What is Leverage on?
The Leverage came on TNT.
Okay.
It was Dean Devlin as the producer, Aldous Hodge, Christian Kane. It's like it's just a really fun show.
All right, I'm closing it out. I'm going SVU.
You would be on a flight to Bermuda Triangle.
I love it though. I
love it too.
Who doesn't like SVU?
You will never have to land. And Chris Maloney's getting his own show.
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm really excited for it. My favorite Law and Order weird tidbit is the guy that made the Dun Dun is this random music composer. He's now worth like $500 million or something like that because the syndication of that thing. Every time any of the Law and Orders plays, he gets paid.
So USA just makes him a billionaire.
Yes, USA has made him a billionaire for just coming up with a very simple musical riff. All right, JJ, close it.
I'm going to close it out. I was going to pick Arrested Development, but I'm going to go with CSI Miami.
Oof.
Big CSI Miami guy. I love it.
Curveball.
It's not a curveball.
That's
you just picked Law and Order SVU.
I think CSI, you could maybe make CSI Miami is
It's episodic. You can just watch a single episode if you want, and then I can switch back to Ninjago. It's just like, I love it.
What do you think, Stacey? What's your verdict on that?
Okay, so cinematically, I like it because it's actually a brightly lit crime show, which is really important because you suddenly realize just how dark New York and Las Vegas are.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, I like it.
All
right. Stacey, can't thank you enough. You have been an amazing guest. We thank you for the time and all of the insight. And if there's anything you want to leave the listener with, any website or any action plan, have the floor.
Well, first of all, I'm going to say this has been so not only much fun, but it has been a true honor to be able to have these conversations. It means a lot because I know you think about these issues in ways that just matter. And so thank you both for having me. Tommy is used to me taking full advantage of our friendship. But JJ, it has been a pleasure to get to know you. Would love for people to read my book, Our Time Is Now, Power, Purpose, and the Fight for Fair America. If you want to do something about voting rights, go to fairfight2020.org. And please, God, complete your census. If you have any questions, go to faircount.org.
Great. Amazing. Love it. Thank you so much.
You.
All right.
You guys take care.
All right. Thanks, Stacey.